All right, we're 1 minute after the hour, so let's go ahead and kick it off. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'd like to welcome you to this event and also welcome Dr. Ruben Puentedura, who is going to talk to us about Black Swans today. And Ruben's also going to join us at our Space Camp event, June 21st through 23rd, and he's actually going to kick it off with the first presentation, and Ruben can tell you a little bit more about that and introduce what we're doing here today.
All right. So thank you so much, Stephanie. So welcome everybody, and glad you all could make it. So today we're going to be talking about not just black swans, but really where black swans come from. And no, don't worry, this isn't going to be a conversation involving cabbages or storks or anything like that. Rather, it's going to be a question more of what black swan nesting grounds look like. And we'll get in a little bit to what those mean and how to spot them and what to do with them and so on. But as Stephanie mentioned, there's another topic that's going to be on the table today, and that's going to be how to use a particular literary tool to think about black swans, nesting grounds, and what you might do with them. And that's science fiction. And in the presentation for Space Camp, I'll be doing a lot more with science fiction. So today we're going to be using it for one specific purpose, but has a little bit of a preview of things to come. One of the things I'll be talking about at Space Camp is the key role that science fiction, and science fiction in particular as metaphor, has had in both shaping how we think about all sorts of aspects of technology, education, many other things in our world, but also how we can use it. And we're going to be doing a little bit with that today. So just a little bit of a preview of things to come. So glad to see you're excited, Brian. Do me a favor and check with Ash and see if Ash has any specific requests for sci-fi stories that Ash would like to hear. So, all right, let me start sharing my screen then. And there we go. All right, so you should all now be able to see the screen. And as I said, today's topic is going to be, okay, so we have black swans and we're watching for black swans, but what do we do about watching for black swans? How do you watch for something you can't even predict is going to show up? Well, I see there are a few things that we can do to help us. So as always, I like to lead off any black swan presentation with a wonderful drawing of this magnificent animal. But just a very quick reminder for people who haven't been a part of all our previous sessions, black swan events cannot be predicted ahead of time. That's a crucial aspect of black swan events. They have a major effect. So these are not the sort of things that you say, interesting, but you don't care otherwise. They really do impact what you're doing severely. And finally, can be rationalized retrospectively. In other words, you can't predict them ahead of time, but once they've happened, you can say, oh yeah, I get why that happened, all right? And that's a black swan event. And the standard archetype for black swan event is the Titanic. Nobody knew it was going to sink. In fact, people were pushing each other out of the way to get the berths on the ship, right? Had a major effect, didn't just, not just the number of people that sadly died on it and so on, but actually changed everything from safety and navigation to how you dealt with the northern routes to radio wave management and so on. And retrospectively, we could say, oh yeah, this is what was wrong with the Titanic that caused it to sink. So that's a black swan event, fine. And the key thing is, if you're doing something that's impacted by a black swan, there are four key paths. The worst one is existential risk. You get hit by the black swan and then you say, bye-bye, you're no longer around for the next stage of things. And sadly, we've seen, for instance, with COVID, we've seen multiple organizations, some education organizations, et cetera, that have not made it through the pandemic and therefore have undergone, as I say, existential risk, which takes them out of the picture. Near-term risk is you emerge wounded with severe damage, but you can keep on existing. You're going to have to repair things, you have to patch things and so on, but you're not in a situation where you're going to disappear, at least right away. So those are the two worst scenarios. The one everybody talks about is, of course, resilience, which is when you come out of a black swan event much the same way you went in. And then you say, great, is that good enough? And the answer is, well, yes and no. I mean, you made it through this Black Swan event, but one problem with resilience is it does nothing to prepare you for the next Black Swan event. And it's very easy to tip over from resilience. Just one tiny change, particularly in a Black Swan context, and you're going to hit into the near-term risk, in other words, into a damage perspective. So you really want to target anti-fragility. And anti-fragility is the scenario where after a Black Swan event, you come out better than you were before. Now, that doesn't mean there's no cost to you of the Black Swan event, okay? This is important to realize. It's not, you say, oh, look, the Black Swan hurt everybody else, but me, I'm just fine. So, no, you may have taken a hit. There may have been damage to you, but overall, as an institution, as an individual, the scope can vary, right? You overall come out ahead of where you were. You may come out with new practices that you say, well, I took this damage, but the new practices now make it feasible for me not just to repair the damage, but actually to undertake new activities I couldn't have before. Or if you're an educational institution, you might be reaching students you never reached before, or you might be teaching them better than you were before, etc. So your target should be anti-fragility. That's what you would like to do. And anti-fragility is one of those things that people say, well, how do you do it? If you don't know when a Black Swan is going to hit or what the nature of it might be, how do you prepare for it? Well, part of today is going to be just focusing on exactly this topic. One key set of tools, one key set of approaches that allows you to enhance the anti-fragility of your institution and move forward. Now, one more thing I'm going to mention again very briefly. All the videos of the previous presentations are available for you. I'm just doing a quick recap for people who haven't seen them. When you're looking at what's happening with an institution, with an individual, when they get hit by a Black Swan, you need to look at three aspects of system dynamics, which is when you're looking at sort of big picture type things. You know, if you're thinking about students, you're not thinking about individual students, you're thinking about groups of students. Or if you're thinking about cash flows, you're not looking at every individual donor or student tuition, but you're looking at, you know, is cash coming in categories A, B, C. Or if you're looking, for instance, at the things, let's take out the education realm for a second. You're looking at things such as production. You're not looking at every single thing you make individually. You're looking at classes of things you manufacture. In system dynamics, you're looking at how things flow from one place to another. So students flow in or out of your institution, cash flows in or out of an institution, organization, etc. And also how you have feedback loops telling you you need more students, you need fewer students, you need more cash, you need less cash, etc. But it's a big picture item. At the agents level, you're looking at how individual choices, actions, etc. can shift what's going on. So you can have a big picture item, say for instance, you're looking at restaurants in a row of restaurants, and that gives you the big picture item for how likely each restaurant is to survive on a base level. But the individual behaviors, that people that say, oh, that one looks like a popular restaurant, I'm going to go there, can suddenly spell success or disaster for a restaurant. So that's the agent level. And at the network level, you're looking at how people are connected to each other. So to stay with the restaurant example for a second, that's the level at which people are saying to each other, hey, let me get on my Twitter feed and tweet out to all people how great or how terrible this restaurant is. And suddenly that restaurant is not just being governed by those big picture, well, how much am I spending on food? How much am I investing in improving my food quality, etc. Or even just how many people are standing outside the door on a given day, but the networks that connect information about that restaurant. So these three items need to enter the picture as we're thinking about these things. And again, if you're an educational institution, and most of you come or work for educational institutions, these are key elements. How do you make a unit of instruction anti-fragile? How do you make a course anti-fragile, building on units of instruction? How do you make a degree program anti-fragile? And how do you make an institution anti-fragile? All of these are questions that you need to be thinking about in light of Black Swan events. But the key question at the heart of it, behind it all, is ultimately, how do you make student learning anti-fragile? And again, part of what we're going to be doing today is developing some tools for doing just that, for looking for, if not where Black Swans are, where they might be coming from, and then tools for thinking about what we might do with them once discovered. All right, So I told you, you can't tell when a black swan is going to hit you or where it's coming from. But it is true that you can identify places that are likely to give rise to black swans. And over the past few years, I've been working on the question of, can we come up with a compact set of what I'm calling nesting grounds for black swans? These are not black swans in and of themselves. Each of these are well-known processes. Each of these are well-known contexts that exist right now. So none of these are black swans, but they are nesting grounds for black swans. Within themselves, they have conditions. Within themselves, they have interactions that can lead to black swan emerging. Tom, I disagree. IT is usually not a black swan. Things that come from within IT can be black swans. And we're going to talk about that later. But IT itself, in terms of processes and so on, there are far, far fewer surprises than people think. People say, oh, they never expected that. That, frankly, is usually a case of lack of information rather than black swans. So we'll come to that in just a second. But it is important to note that while these are not black swans in and of themselves, they are nesting grounds. And we can then start planning for anti-fragility based upon that. Because if we know where black swans might be emerging from, where black swans might be coming from, we can start to say, well, what can I do? What type of resources can I develop? What should I have on hand? What type of skills should I be thinking about? How should I reconstruct things for things that might be coming from this arena? And again, we'll see how to get to that. All right, so we have 6 of these nesting grounds. 3 of them are in this outer circle. We'll see why the 2 circles, and 3 of them are in the inner circle. In the outside circle, we have climate change, self-explanatory, pandemics. Notice I put that in the plural, not just COVID. I'll come back to that in just a second. And finally, human movements, which is a very general category, but it stretches to cover much more than migrations, refugee movements, etc. In the inner circle, you have 3 items that are designated as the future present of a category. Okay, let me explain that term, future present. I am, to be perfectly frank, very, 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 very tired of people speaking of 21st century skills as though the 21st century were just around the corner. Folks, the 21st century can now get a driver's license. It can go and buy itself a house if it has, somehow the resources to do so. It can be fully employed. The 21st century right now has, we already celebrated its 21st birthday. So it's an adult. Absolutely, Brian, the 21st century should definitely get COVID shots, right? And that's an important thing to talk about. So yes, we are talking about things that have a presence towards the future, but at the same time, it's present. It's right now. So these are not things in the future work will change, or in the future IT. I hear the work one all the time when people say future work will require soft skills. No. Work now requires soft skills, not in the future. That's why I use this term future present to remind people that there is both a present component, but also a projection in this, particularly in this nesting grounds aspect. And one is IT, information technology, much more than just AI. I'll come back to a second. Second one is work, what we consider as work, how work takes place, etc. And finally, living, a category as to how people might choose to live, what they value as the good life, what they can afford to achieve as the good life, etc. All right. So yes, Tom, in the future, we'll teach without a physical classroom. Absolutely. Anybody who hears in their mind, by the way, any one of those film loops, from the 50s, etc., that talked about the world of tomorrow and were satirized in animated cartoon in Futurama, for instance. Yeah, that's kind of the tone. All right, but let's look at each of these now in greater detail. The other loop is what I'm calling the systemic nesting grounds. These are things that exist as large-scale systems that are going to be with us as definitional large-scale systems for at least through to the end of the century, okay? So this is, I'm not talking about the sort of thing that's going to be over next year or the year after. I'm talking about things that are going to be part of the landscape, or that they're going to change how they are going to be part of the landscape, and can be nesting grounds for black swans through to the end of the century. So let's go into each of these 3 in greater First, climate change. All right. For those of you who've been keeping track, the IPCC report, the most recent report, is now complete. All three portions have been released. All three portions are available online. There is a link here to different portions, and I can summarize the results pretty clearly. We now have a pretty clear picture of what the temperatures are going to look like through the end of the century based upon the decisions that we make about how many greenhouse gases we release in the atmosphere, with what composition, etc., how much is CO2, how much is methane, etc., etc. And in this chart you're looking at right now, you can see 5 paths. But strictly speaking, I have some good news and some bad news. The good news is we're not likely to hit either of the top 2 paths, because the economic cost of going on those paths just becomes overwhelming. Think of, if you hit those 2 top paths, it becomes to like a peak worst moment of COVID pandemic every day of the week, okay? That's too expensive. In other words, there's at that point, what happens is those even begin to fall apart of their own accord, because economic activity becomes unsustainable when you start to hit those paths. In other words, it is extremely unlikely that you're going to be looking at what you see there labeled as the SSP 3 to 7 or 5 to 8.5 scenario, which you can see, of course, the corresponding temperature increases. That's the good news as far as it goes. Not necessarily perhaps for the best reason, because it's not a question of, and we're all, going to conservatively save for no matter what, we're not going to hit it. It just becomes too expensive to not hit that. But by the same token, the bad news is we're almost certainly not going to hit even the second of the 2 scenarios, let alone everybody's pet favorite, the SSP 1 to 1.9, which is keeping the degree range going carbon neutral as early as shortly after 2050, keeping the increase in temperature as small as possible. Sorry, folks, we're just not going to hit it. It is physically impossible to hit it. All the necessary components that need to be in place cannot be achieved over that period of time. And furthermore, even if you could, it would take the coordinated action of at least the top few dozen world economies to coordinately act to bring it down to that point. You may have noticed that some of those economies seem to be at war with each other. Not going to happen. Sorry. And what's more, to me, it's important to realize that this is a question not just of black swans, but a question of planning. Remember what I said about how easily you can go from resilience to one of the worst case scenarios? Okay, this is one place where if you instead of saying, well, no, we'll try, we'll keep on going gradually, the answer is you're more likely going to do harm. So in other words, you're better off trying to work for one of the other scenarios. And I'll tell you right now that I would gauge SSP 2 to 4.5 as the most likely scenario than you are if you're just saying, well, we'll still try. There is a point at which still trying for a goal that's unachievable actually causes harm down the road. There are many ways we can go to that middle level. Some of those ways are more equitable, less harmful than others. All of them involve pain. I will not make any comments otherwise, but there are better and worse ways. That being the case, then let's look at this and say, okay, so what are you looking at in terms of black swans? Well, what you're looking at here as climate changes is a scenario where it's not a question of something completely new emerges. Rather, you're looking at certain events becoming more frequent and somewhat more enhanced, for lack of a better word, than they were before. So we saw it recently with the heat wave in India and Pakistan. It's not that you've not seen heat waves or serious heat waves before, but you're seeing them a bit more frequently with somewhat higher temperatures than you have before. Now, somewhat higher can make a huge difference. So make no mistake, that's not an attempt to say that doesn't matter. I'm going to show you some illustrations in that regard in just a sec. Or you may be seeing more commonly events that used to happen once every 10 years, once every 5 years, or even once every 2 years. And again, these are not entirely new events, but what you've done is you've changed the statistical frequency and how hard it is to predict necessarily when they're going to occur. So right off the bat, climate change is already a direct source for black swans in terms of these changes. But then you have all the additional changes that ride upon it. You could have things related to, well, where can you live safely? Where can you grow crops? Where will animal species live? Which animal species will migrate from one location to another? All sorts of interesting things that will happen and challenging things as a result of climate change. So that's the first of our nesting grounds. Second nesting ground is pandemics. And I'm just going to show you one shot here, if you will, from what is COVID right now, with all the mutations we've seen with COVID since the beginning of the pandemic. But this is just one disease. And if it were just COVID that we're looking at, then I'd say, fine. You know, we can deal with COVID. We will eventually have a reasonable set of policies and so on. But it keeps mutating. And the trouble is, COVID is not the only one. We still have malaria causing issues. We have other illnesses that have shown up on the landscape, Zika, for instance, being one in recent years. We still have in much of the world tuberculosis. We still have in much of the world different varieties of HIV/AIDS under different and varying degrees of effectiveness of control. In many cases, it's not just a question of whether it's a new disease. It's a question of what we can do, how we can respond to it, the whole set of policies. So for that reason, pandemics will continue to be important. And I'm sorry, I was going to say, well, maybe I won't say anything about it, but I can't help but point out we now seem to have monkeypox saying hello just over the horizon. I don't know if monkeypox is going to become a serious issue or not. I hope it's not. But that's exactly in the nature of black swans. I cannot predict ahead of time that whether monkeypox is or is not going to be a black swan. I can simply say it is coming out of this nesting ground, which can give rise to black swans. The third nesting ground I mentioned in this category was of human movements. Now let me explain why am I using a more general term like movements rather than something more specific along the lines of migrations, etc. Well, because I'm trying to encompass the entire range of this. Yes, of course, you have large-scale migrations, whether it's for economic reasons or wars or food deprivation or fill in the blank for any number of reasons. But you also have other movements. You have movements in or out of cities. I want to show you here, for instance, the movement into Shanghai. You all saw recently how the Chinese government chose to handle COVID in the city of Shanghai. And I saw many people discussing it as though it were, well, it's just the same as any other city. Folks, you've got 28 million people, 28.5 million people in Shanghai. We can argue, by the way, the exact number. There's a question of where you set administrative boundaries, etc. in Shanghai. You're handling a scale of city that we don't have a whole lot of experience handling. There aren't those many mega cities on this scale. And there aren't those many mega cities on this scale that haven't arisen as Shanghai has over a very short period of time. You're talking just over roughly 3 decades. You've seen it go from roughly 5 million up to its current size. This is a huge shift. This is a nesting ground. And again, there are going to be, as a result, black swans. And finally, I even want to take the smallest scale. Where are people moving to or from as they work? We saw it with COVID. People suddenly saying, hey, you know what, maybe I don't need to go to work. And suddenly you start to change. How many people are using public transportation? How many people are moving within a city? How many people are moving in or out of cities? You'll also notice that despite mayors, etc., police, workplaces saying we're going back and so on, you'll notice we haven't gone back to where things were exactly. So again, this is yet another scale for the human movement. So the human movements go all the way from the very small scale, where am I going to from to live and work, to the very large scale. What's a large scale migration, such as, for instance, what we're seeing out of Ukraine with the war right now. So these three are nesting grounds. Now, think about how these might affect you. I'm going to give you a little exercise in a little bit, where I'm going to ask you to do this. Think about how these nesting grounds will affect you. But I want to give you a few more tools before we get to that point. Here are the relational nesting grounds, and they're the ones that have to do more with the day-to-day interaction of people, but they've also got the same time scope. In fact, they probably will never go away. Unlike, say, with climate change, you can't see a day when these won't show up, but the scale and how much they apply tends to be on a much more individual, local scale and human direct interaction scale than the others. If you will, these are more affected by some aspects of the agent and network scales. The others are affected more by the system scale. All of them are affected by all the scales, make no mistake, but there is a difference in how these work. And as I say, we have these three. Now, for IT, I want to emphasize this isn't artificial intelligence. In fact, I'm a little tired of people who just say, and artificial intelligence, as though it were the magical wand to either do very evil things or very good things. And a lot of what's called AI itself, yeah, we've had that for years. That's not exactly new. It's the scale, availability, and interaction with other things. But it's not just AI. It's also other forms of automation that do not require artificial intelligence, that will have a human being somewhere in the loop making the decisions. But the handling, as in many robots, for instance, that are not fully automated, still involves a human being. Or you have, as in this diagram here, social media and the different interactions involved in social media. So for instance, this is where people get their news in the US, and you find that Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc., all of these play a key role in terms of how people get news. And again, think of what that does in terms of creating different phenomena. You know, we've all seen the discussions on the impact upon democracy, etc., but it affects a huge range of possibilities, a huge range of options, a huge range of what is communicated, how it's communicated, why it's communicated, etc. Once again, in and of itself, it's not a black swan. It's just how many people use Twitter or Facebook, etc. But if people suddenly start talking with each other on Twitter in a way different than they do on Facebook, and more people are getting their news from one than from the other, suddenly different things start to happen. I'll also mention that this changes locally rather dramatically. Recently in Costa Rica, and for instance, WhatsApp plays a much, much, much bigger role, as it does, quite frankly, in much of the rest of the world, than it does here in the States. So sometimes what you assume will work in terms of news propagation, etc., in one place, does not in the other. So this is a nesting ground, once again, for black swans. This type of interaction with all the different features, aspects, tools of IT. I mentioned work as the second domain. Now, some of you who've seen me speak before know I've pulled out this chart before, and it has to do with the fact that if you think about how artificial intelligence is going to be used, there are two ways of thinking about it. One in which you think that it replaces an entire job. That's the dashed line in this diagram. And that gives you one distribution of what percentage of the current workforce you can automate. The other way is to assume, no, people don't have a whole job replaced by and large. Instead, they have chunks of jobs replaced. And there may be a realignment of jobs. Two jobs may emerge. So somebody still loses a job, but it's not because their job got replaced, right? It's because some of their tasks got replaced and somebody else's tasks got replaced and two jobs got merged. I was already showing this before the pandemic. The thing is, now with the pandemic and some of the evolution of changes in how people work, where people work on their teams, this diagram has gone higgledy-piggledy in terms of the actual impact. It's no longer the case where you used to be able to say, well, this whole range of professions are going to go like this, and this one's going to go like that. We're seeing strange mixes and matches. The backdrop is still that there is a shift in work changes. But what you're seeing that result in terms of big picture, hours of work, where people are working, which jobs employers are saying, please don't leave, I'll pay you whatever it takes, and which jobs employers are saying, hey, it was fun having you here, goodbye. And we're seeing all of this. It's not as simple as the Great Resignation or all businesses are hiring, or all businesses have labor costs that are increasing. It's a mix. And this is because this type of scenario remains a nesting ground for black swans. And the black swans are the different elements that we're seeing. where you're seeing, for instance, professions that can't get somebody in ways to fill jobs in ways that you wouldn't expect, and vice versa. The last one I mentioned is future present of living. And one of the things here, I wanted to not make it clear that sometimes black swans don't look bad, but they may be unexpected. So this is a question of what happened during the pandemic. What did people value as I'm doing good, I'm doing a good act? And here's the interesting thing. In the first year of the pandemic, in 2020, you see relatively small numbers compared to baseline. And in particular, you see a relatively large increase in negative effect, people saying, all sorts of negative impact, impression type things. In the second year of the pandemic, we see an increase, a greater increase in benevolent acts and a decrease in negative affect. Now that's interesting. That's interesting because it runs counter to the standard narrative of everything was great or everything was terrible. It's telling you there are interesting interactions here. It's telling you that what people value is shifting, even as we speak, within the span of a year, measurably so, and in ways that are not necessarily as simple as saying, oh, it all shifted this way or it all shifted that way. So how people choose to live, what they value as the good life, how they choose to achieve it, etc., is this third nesting ground for black swans. Again, it's not a question of it's all going to be good, it's all going to be bad. It's a question of it is shifting, it is changing, and you need to factor that into the picture. So those are the nesting grounds for black swans. And what the nesting grounds for black swans then do is they don't tell you what the black swan is going to be, but they start to spell out a domain. And now think of this from your perspective as somebody at an educational institution. Some of these may have a direct impact upon you. No razor with COVID, right? Kids are sick, they can't come to school, but that's just COVID. What if you had an illness where it would work the reverse way, where you needed to make sure that people were in protected areas? So if, say, you had to protect kids from illness, you might choose instead to create camps or scenarios, or if they themselves were ill, where suddenly you'd be providing education, but not to homes, but to groups of people elsewhere. Or you might have, if climate change changes, a scenario where individual homes might not be livable, but you might be able to create more collective scenarios where people could gather in ways you couldn't otherwise. Or conversely, with human movements, this is a big issue for anybody working in the refugee scenario. How do we provide access to refugees to educational learning organizations? What does that do to your profile? Are you going to be one of the organizations that finds a large number of refugees coming in? How does that shift your calculus? How does it shift where you teach for any of these? If you're an organization that looks at work, how do you change how somebody gets a diploma? We've done a series with ShapingEDU on micro-credentials, right? Well, it isn't an abstract question when you're thinking about these as black swan grounds. So I'm going to suggest that you start thinking about this and go work through one example, just to show you how some of these pieces come together in a context that's not terribly surprising, but is the sort of thing you want to be thinking about. Side note, I just noticed that Brian just put a link in the chat to both the discussion of the IPCC report and his new book on climate change and higher ed. I'll second the recommendation for the book. Pretty please get it, because Brian is doing exactly the kind of thinking I've just been talking about this last couple of minutes. So exactly, Brian, how many campuses are prepared to host, teach, or otherwise support climate change? That's exactly right. And again, this is important. These are not trivial questions. So let's talk a little bit about, sadly, war. The war between Russia and Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. All right. One thing that climate change does is it makes some products less valuable over time and other products more valuable over time. For instance, because I told you that it's unlikely that we're going to be extremely unlikely that we're going to just allow things to go completely out of control to the highest two numbers, at some point you have to start cutting the use of greenhouse gases. That means that you have a good that's becoming less valuable over time because fewer people want it, okay? So as a broad trend, I'm going to put some caveats on this. A country like Russia that has a large percentage of its economy based upon materials that produce greenhouse gases, oil, coal, gas, has something that's becoming less valuable over time. But by the same token, global climate change, global warming, makes some other things more valuable. For instance, one of the things that makes more valuable is wheat. It makes all food more valuable. Why? Because you have a reduction in arable lands and lower yield as a result of impact of climate change. We'll look a little bit in just a second at a very concrete example there. So it makes sense to somehow maximize the value you're getting from the latter and start phasing out the former. That's one approach. You could also say, who's my competitor? And can I say, increase the value of the latter more rapidly if they can't export? You could look at the former and say, under certain circumstances, such as scarcity, could I drive out the price? You're seeing both of those right now. Russia is getting paid more per unit for its oil, gas, coal, but is also in a position where the blocking of Ukrainian exports of wheat is important. If you look at this chart, you can see that for wheat, there aren't many countries that have huge export. This is actually all cereals, not just wheat. I could show you wheat, but the general picture follows for this. And you find that in the large scale, you've got the US as the largest one, but after that, you have Canada, Argentina, France, Australia, India. I'll come back to India in just a second. And then it's the Russian Federation and Ukraine. Now, this is the point at which people say, Ruben, are you saying that this caused the war? Not in the least. I don't think that it was a cause of the war. But it's one of the things that sustains the possibility for a war in conditions which otherwise might not be sustainable. And that's where you start to get the black swan events, where it's not just that the war happens, but that certain interactions with events suddenly make certain paths sustainable or sustainable longer than they might be otherwise. It makes certain approaches different than they may await. But again, let me emphasize, I'm not saying this is a cause. For instance, by the same token, Russia and Ukraine could have decided to form a partnership, cartelize their production of wheat so as to maintain an artificially sustained high price and increase their revenue that way. That is also a possibility. And there could have been an agreement to cut back production of oil, gas, etc., so as to tighten supply to increase the price. In that case, we'd all be complaining, of course, about what happened there. Make no mistake, somebody would get negative impact from it, but it wouldn't be a war. So I want to be careful to say this doesn't cause a war. But in terms of thinking about black swans, you start to ask, well, how does this shape the evolution and development of a war in ways it might not otherwise do? And in this case now, let's look at India. India is also an exporter, so it's one of the main exporters for cereals. But India just got hit, climate change, once again, by a heat wave. And guess what? From this map, overlay the two maps, and you can see what's happened. Some of the wheat growing regions are also among the hardest hit by the heat wave. Now, if you look at what's happened so far, it doesn't look like India is going to get into internal food safety, but some of the production in some of the smaller wheat producing regions may be so impacted that people will move from those regions to other regions. That human movements aspect I mentioned before. And it's definitely going to impact exporting capability. So what we are looking at overall is, yes, the creation of food insecurity, potentially as far as famines in other parts of the world, because of the black swan scenarios emerging from this interaction with the war in Russia and Ukraine. Were it not for these nesting grounds and for how the war interacts with these nesting grounds, people would say, well, that's a local issue, but why am I in sub-Saharan Africa impacted by it? Well, you're impacted by it now because of these interactions. If you're a country that was a net importer of wheat, and suddenly finds that wheat is either not available or too expensive for you to afford. All right. So with that in hand, let's look at one last aspect, and that is to say, okay, so you've got that. What else could you do in terms of saying, okay, now I'll be thinking proactive in terms of anti-fragility? I want to show you this because this is in some ways analogous to the type of response I see sometimes from people at academic institutions. You might say, well, we have a certain agricultural production, let's increase the amount of land being used. Thing is, the world has already passed peak agricultural land. And the reason I mention this is because this is one of the easiest ones that people will say, well, okay, let's all plant more wheat. Where? You're already past peak agricultural land. Could you try to draft some land back into service as wheat? Yeah, but it takes time to draft land into agricultural use. And we're not in a position where we just see a steady increase. So we could say, well, we expect land to have been just over the horizon ready to use. So that's not going to work. And whenever you see a solution in academia that says, hey, let's just put an ad out there for more students, looks an awful lot like, let's put some more land into service. So this is going to lead, and I'm going to save this for another time, to what I call a state of hybridity. In other words, interactions in this world, and particularly in academia, have a certain aspect in which they can neither be viewed as taking place in their old spaces or entirely in a completely cleanly defined new space. And some of that is the simplest definition of hybridity that we've had, namely, are you teaching in a blend of students remotely, students in a classroom? But it's deeper and more complex than that. I'm just going to say this for now, just to give you a little bit of a hint of how you might think about this. All right, I will give you 5 minutes to use the chat. I've given you these contexts for black swans. So given this context, what do you see as a nesting ground intersection that's likely to affect your institution? Okay, so go. Brian has already suggested, how many campuses are prepared to host, teach, or otherwise support climate refugees. What else? Again, absolutely, Brian, climate change worsening the number of diseases, right? That's going to have an impact on your campuses. Again, think about these. Don't be scared to, throw ideas out. Be wild, if you will. We're going to see in just a second just how wild can be. So Thomas is talking about the intersection of climate events and lack of flexibility in course planning. Yeah, right. Okay, that lack of flexibility. If you're locking in a temporal succession when you can get hit by different black swan events from these aspects, and particularly climate events, that's going to be a source of fragility, and that's an intersection that's likely to affect your institution. Well, people are thinking, let me throw another one at you. One thing we learned during COVID is that one thing that was very good for COVID was ventilating rooms. One thing we learned through many years of climate change management is that in hot areas, ventilating rooms can actually be problematic. You have a collision. How do you handle it? Are your buildings ready to handle this? I've seen some excellent work on this in Singapore, for instance, with living walls that both ventilate and cool. But is your campus designed for it? No. What are you going to do about it? What do you do? Johns has climate change affecting in-person performance in areas disproportionately affected. Absolutely, John. Thank you. And you've got climate change. I'll also mention illness. With long COVID, we are seeing impact, whether it's cognitive in some cases or fatigue. A child with long COVID, a student, a middle-aged person, whoever with long COVID has limits that they might never have had before in terms of how their performance is structured throughout the day. So absolutely, John. Stacy says the extremists in political views. Certainly, absolutely, Stacy. This is something that is important because sometimes I'll see the political views as something completely independent of other things. And it's not, it's coupled to all of this. So if you're looking at extremism and political views, if you have a system that is likely to, for instance, have to deal with restrictions that the extremist groups, resent, you'd better have a plan for dealing with this because that might be necessary, for instance, for a climate change or a health event. And Brian agrees with Stacy. John says the progression of disciplinary knowledge can be a nesting ground. Absolutely. And this is another one. Once again, this is the point at which we need to start thinking seriously about curriculum, not just from a big, do we teach history or do we teach sociology? Yes and yes, by the way, and do we teach biology? Yes, etc. It's not that big picture, but it's a question of how do you mesh these things? How do they fit together? All right. Thank you. You've got some great ideas here. We're going to save the chat, by the way. So anybody who would like access to it will be able to get it. But now, let me go to the second part of this, or the coda, and you're going to hear more about this at the Space Camp event, which is the how do you develop thinking for this, other than go, it's coming, I have a certain fondness for walking around with a sign on my shoulder saying the end is coming, but it tends to not be all that productive in terms of creating anti-fragility. Yeah, exactly. I like the emoji for the scare. So what we need is something that can act sort of like a telescope, something that can act, like a search for extraterrestrial intelligence to help us start to look for things that we're not even sure what they look like. With CT, we didn't even know. We still don't know what an extraterrestrial signal looked like. So there's my tribute to Arecibo, which sadly fell apart last year, and I still miss it terribly. But one of the things about this is it was part of that idea. How do you look for things when you don't necessarily have a full picture? And there we have something very important, and that's the role of this. Do people know what this is? Please feel free to type into the chat. A luggage cart. Very good. And how do you refer to something that's like a luggage cart? Luggage buggy, very good, yes. The word for luggage cart in Greek is metaphor. Metaphor, to take from one place to another. I didn't realize that. I have to owe that insight to Stephen Jay Gould, who wrote a wonderful essay where he was talking about the power of metaphor, the import of metaphor, and that's what he showed. There's not the one he showed. I don't have a copy of, I don't have a Stephen Jay Gould's, the actual luggage cart he saw. But that's important. Metaphor is a powerful tool for when we're thinking about things like the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, or when, as is the case here, we are thinking about how do we think about black swans we can't see when all we can see are the nesting grounds. We can point our telescope. We can say that star looks good, but how do we look for that? Well, we need metaphor. We need to start thinking about that. And in that context of metaphor, science fiction is an incredibly powerful tool. So I'm going to be talking a lot more about this at Space Camp. So I actually made some adjustments. So today I'm just going to give you a taste. We're going to do more formal work on this at Space Camp. Please sign up for Space Camp if you haven't. It's going to be fun. Lots more fun stuff there, I promise. But let's talk about why science fiction in particular. Now you can think about a lot of things like, well, science fiction deals with technology, but I'm not interested in science fiction in terms of its prediction aspect. As we're going to see, science fiction as prediction doesn't do very much to write. But I love this definition by Miriam Allen Ford, who was a science fiction writer herself, by the way, who said, look, science fiction deals with improbable possibilities, fantasy, so Lord of the Rings, dragon stories, etc., with plausible impossibilities. Brian probably is about to pounce and say, there is a gray area between the two. I know. But for now, let's pretend that science fiction is one thing and science fiction is another. Tom, I do actually also like speculative fiction myself, but there is a point, just like I prefer, a sequential art instead of comics. I do prefer speculative fiction in some ways to science fiction, but everybody has a rough idea of what science fiction is. Everybody has a rough idea of what comics is. We'll say speculative fiction for the space camp discussion, all right? But think about it this way, that improbable possibility is exactly where things are at, where things need to be at to start to give us that lens, that perspective that allows us to see what's coming down the road. And I want to emphasize the aspect that it's that metaphor of those improbable possibilities, which is exactly what black swans are. At the end of the day, science fiction is, in a way, talking about black swans. But when people say, but what about the predictions? What about Jules Verne and his predictions? Look, I am here showing you Jules Verne's view of the space capsule that went to the moon. Doesn't it look just like Apollo? No, it doesn't. It looks like a hollowed out cannon shell with a couch in it, all right? And the thing about the approach taken in from the Earth to the moon is that it would squish the astronauts to a fine, fine pulp if you shot a cannon, which Jules Verne knew. But people say, but what about the fact he had it launching from further and all the calculations and so on? Yeah, Jules Verne told you at the time, it wasn't a secret. He said, of course, I consulted with scientists. I spoke with mathematicians and physicists. He had relatives who were scientists. I did a lot of research. Why? Because he wanted to create an exciting tale of exploration that could be plausible enough. So the technology up to the point. And so we figure out enough to say, okay, so it's not, a magical dragon that flies people to the moon. It's a technological tool. And the details, good enough, okay? He figures out enough for this to be, okay, I'll suspend disbelief. The metaphor is working to do that, but please, it doesn't predict a single thing that wasn't already known at that time about what it would take to launch something to the moon, all right? And you say, okay, so is Jules Verne no use? No, hold on. Jules Verne can be very useful if you take Jules Verne as metaphor, because that same story from the Earth to the moon is also about what happens when the industry, the machinery that produces armament for war, suddenly says, this is the very first chapter of the book, says, well, war, yes, war, but gentlemen, it says one of the speakers, alas, war is not something we can do right now. And in a way, and it is a satirical comment, of course, you have here people who have been maimed, wounded, etc., by weapons of war, and you have the analogs being shown on pages. Jules Verne is actually talking about something that's a very interesting metaphor for military-industrial complex. So from the Earth to the moon and around the moon, if you're trying to build a spaceship, it's exciting. It inspires people to explore, perhaps. But with value is if you're going to use it for real intellectual exploration, start exploring what it has to say. What is Jules Verne getting at as metaphor for a military-industrial complex? And he's doing this long before Eisenhower. Now that's interesting. And again, he's not describing something that nobody else had seen. Many other people saw this too, but he finds this value. And there's some very interesting things. Why is he putting this in the US? But his hero is a Frenchman, and you need to sell books, all sorts of interesting things, but think of it as metaphor. In the last few minutes that we have, I will give you a first taste that I'm going to play out in full when we go to Space Camp. I will give you a first taste and an exercise to do, if you so wish. I strongly encourage you to try it out before you do Space Camp, which is how do you then use science fiction as metaphor? In the Space Camp session, I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about how different branches of, yes, speculative fiction. Brian, you mentioned Harlan Ellison. I will say that as a preteen and teen, I was strongly influenced by the collections of science fiction that Harlan Ellison put together. The Dangerous Visions was, among other, the work of David Knight and others as well, a strong influence upon me, so I fully sympathize with his viewpoint. But for right now, I just want to give you a taste. So let's talk about where we've seen science fiction as metaphor and just give you a few highlights. So we have Ray Bradbury's Martian Chronicles. And Ray Bradbury in the Martian Chronicles, you think, it's about going to Mars. If you've read the Martian Chronicles, it's an allegory, among many other things, for the colonization of the Americas and what happened with the First Nations, Native Americans, in light of the entry of the colonizers, both from direct violent interaction, disease, the destruction of a culture, what another culture interacting with it does. As far as figuring out how we get to Mars, it tells you nothing. As far as allowing you to think about black swan scenarios in terms of the interaction of cultures, in terms of the interaction of cultures and disease, etc., rich trove. Suppose you're talking then, take it a step further, you're saying, well, but hold on. Bradbury has this sort of very romanticized version. What happens if you start playing the question of colonizer to colonized now with more specific interactions? In The Left Hand of Darkness, with ideas of what is gender. In the Word for World is Forced, with an environment and a very different take of environment. And now we get the work of Ursula K. Le Guin. And again, if you're going to try to say, well, this is how human gender plays out in human societies biologically, there's nothing for you in The Left Hand of Darkness. If you're trying to talk about how gender evolves through interaction with cultures, certain aspects of fluidity, you've got some interesting stuff there. You want to talk about ecosystems and the details of ecosystems, there's some of that in The Word for World is Forced. You want to think about the metaphor of the interaction of cultures with an environment. Now you've got something really rich there. So again, keep thinking metaphor. But now take a step back, think further. Suppose you're talking about just all of these complex factors coming together. Well, both John Brunner and Sansabar or Gibson and Neuromancer say, hey, these are worlds where things are really, really complicated. And in both of them, they actually happen to have artificial intelligence as a component. And neither of them had the foggiest idea when they wrote these books what on earth real AI looks like. But if you're talking about the interactions of a complex world and how people might conceive of AI, particularly strong in both books, how certain things might be triggered, where you might look for things, don't look for the technical thing, okay? Don't look for whether you should, put it in this computer or that computer or what the exact algorithm. Neither of them is talking about that, but the metaphor for what's happening here is powerful. Take a step now away from this. Say you have this complex world. What happens when people migrate into a complex world and they do not wish to take on all of that complex world? Say hello to Zena Henderson. Zena Henderson is fascinating in more ways than one because this question, which of course comes up in the context of refugees, exiles, etc., as well as other big migratory movements, is not dealt with from a perspective that everybody's going to agree with. In fact, one of the reasons I mentioned Zena Henderson here is Henderson can be quite problematic, and that's interesting. The metaphor does not always have to work the way you'd like it to work. To close, one last example, Octavia Butler's The Parables, the parable of the sower and the parable of the talents. And Octavia Butler is interested in social justice, in dystopic worlds, in worlds where dystopia, however, is not and then a big nuclear war occurs and everything is bad forever. It's the type of dystopias, Stacy, you were talking about authoritarianism. The dystopias in Octavia Butler are the type of dystopias that result from factors like the black swans that we've discussed, from the nesting grounds that we've talked about, interacting with tendencies towards authoritarianism, towards oversimplifying. Our protagonists even may oversimplify in this, and yet with possibilities for social justice construction. Again, don't take it as a recipe for, and this is how you deal with authoritarianism. But if you're looking for that particular angle in a world shaped by the type of black swans we're talking about, here's a valuable metaphor to look for. So here's the challenge I'm going to leave you with as we wrap up. And I apologize, I'm running a couple of minutes over, but I promise we'll be done in just a couple. One of the things you can do is read all of these and many other examples. I'll talk more about that at Space Camp. But I always like to leave people with an idea to make something. And I think that dealing with these challenges, the black swans that result from this and so on, requires not just sitting back and saying, yes, I will read Bradbury and yes, think a lot about it. And no, you want to make something. One of the things you can make is make your own make your own science fiction. But writing a whole novel takes a while. And actually, for a variety of reasons, I'll argue on at Space Camp, science fiction does best as short story, really, or closer to short story. There are exceptions, but by and large, the short story is friendlier overall to science fiction than some of the more bulky novel would be. And we have here then, for types of what are called flash fiction. Flash fiction are very, very short forms of fiction, okay? So don't try writing a whole novel or even a traditional short story. Try to see if you can write some science fiction that allows you to think as metaphor, okay? Don't tell me, I'm gonna write the science fiction story that says exactly what I did in the classroom. That's nice, but you might as well draft that as an action plan for your school, okay? Instead, think of metaphors that help you think about this, metaphors that help you work with this. And these are some of the short stories. So the shortest one is the 6-word story. Everybody knows the example that Hemingway did not write, folks. He did not write For Sale, Baby Shoes, Never Worn. Great 6-word story, but Hemingway did not write. All right? And we can get into a whole question as to why some authors get certain things attributed, even if they never wrote. So that's a standard 6-word story. But then you have Twitterature, which used to be 140 characters, now it's 280 characters. And that's a particularly rich one. Because to your point, Tom, do we have a place to collect these creations? The answer is yes. When we send out an email, we'll encourage people to submit. We'll do more with this as well to encourage people to submit at Space Camp. But also Twitter can be, if you're writing Twitterature, so less than 280 characters, or small blocks that can be broken into 2 or 3, no more than that. Okay, we can, Brian and I both have some experience with some of the issues that arise when you start doing really long threads on Twitter like this. But if you're writing Twitterature, then you have a very compact form that can be shared readily with others and bring them into your metaphor, into your thinking. Then we have microfiction, which some argument as to what the threshold is, but I use 100 words. And then you go up by an order of magnitude to what's called the general category of flash fiction, and that's 1,000 words or fewer. Again, some people will go up to 1,500. It really doesn't terribly matter, folks. If you're counting down to the individual word, it's usually not necessarily the greatest thing to be doing. But this gives you the picture. So start thinking about what you could write. And I'm going to just give you very quickly an example here from Franz Kafka for microfiction. It was very early in the morning. The streets clean and deserted. I was walking to the station. As I compared the tower clock with my watch, I realized it was already much later than I had thought. I had to hurry. The shock of this discovery made me unsure of the way. I did not yet know my way very well in this town. Luckily, a policeman was nearby. I ran up to him and breathlessly asked him the way. He smiled and said, "From me, you want to know the way?" "Yes," I said, "since I cannot find it myself." "Give it up. Give it up," he said, and turned away with a sudden jerk, like people who want to be alone with their laughter. So that's an example of microfiction from Franz Kafka. Don't worry, okay? Nobody's expecting you to match Franz Kafka on your first outing doing this, but just to get an idea of just how much you can say. Or here's some Twitterature from T.R. Darling, who is on Twitter under @QuiteKindCheese. "The king would not have banned alchemy if all it did was transmute lead into gold. Such a process could be controlled to profit. No, the real threat was turning gold into lead. If people started thinking of gold as something temporary and transient, his fortune was worthless." Kind of useful to think of this for metaphor. And one example of early Twitterature in the old format. "These readings can't be real," she scoffed. alien ships this large and numerous would be visible. She looked to the sky and the stars. So all of you are going to get these, you'll have these, etc. And here are some practical tips. You will have a hook, a conflict, and an end. All right? So 3 parts, even if you have that, but not necessarily as structured as plot points, but there has to be something that acts as a hook, something that sets up a conflict, and something that gives you an end. Keep the characters or plot points to a minimum. So all of these have 1, 2 characters, minimum number of plot points, a couple at most. Maximize each world yield, please. No cliches. A cliche is, it just, everybody uses it, so it becomes meaningless, but also don't go with word salad as a somewhat fat, yet not too chubby young gentleman. Find a single word to do the whole work for you. And finally, look for verbs that include an understanding of how something is done. You need each verb to pack a punch. Think of that. And interestingly enough, think of all 4 of these tips in terms of, once again, metaphor. How you craft metaphor, how you create metaphor, etc. And let's see, Tom has already jumped in. Left planet, culture followed, green planet. Nice, Tom, very nice. And so round of applause for Monsieur Tom from, for jumping in right away. This is as far as I wanted to take you today. I'm going to be doing a lot more at Space Camp. We're going to have more opportunities. I'm going to make sure all of you who wish to will have these slides, of course, available to you. But again, think of this. I recommend that Twitter Tour is a particularly powerful format, okay? But think of a science fiction story that helps you think or ask questions about one of the nesting ground intersections you identified. That's it. Here are some additional resources. Don't worry, you'll have the slides. This is for those of you who haven't been at all the Black Swan sessions. And again, here's my contact info. Let me thank you all for coming. I'll stick around if any of you have questions or comments you'd like to make. I also want to thank everybody who's been gamely participating along and following in the chat and making comments. I really appreciate it. I like to see lively chats, so thank you. And I, again, encourage you all to come to Space Camp, where we'll get a bit deeper into science fiction and why science fiction has been so crucial as metaphor. So far, I've shown you that it can be used as metaphor. Space Camp will get a little bit more into the history and the power it's had. So I hope to see you all there. Thank you so much.